let's get started. I drew this on a piece of paper, I think a few years ago now for somebody. So, and he brought it back in for, I think it was a year. And so I don't know if you out there have ever worked with a coach or a psychologist, but sometimes I get so worked up about something, I draw it out and I give it to a person and say, okay, this is how I want you to remember what we just talked about. So I drew this for somebody a few years ago. We used it. And I just thought, you know what? This is everything I like to think about and talk about and teach in one little grid. So by the time we leave each other today, you will understand what this grid is all about. Okay, that is my commitment to you. So the Behave Forward framework, this will be the only slide with this many words. I did that so that you get a sense of what I want to do today. I want you to leave me thinking about those 4 quadrants: thinking, feeling, body, and behavior. I want you to understand how to toggle around in between those 4 quadrants. I want you to leave and become a fellow psychological flexibility proselytizer. And I want you to think about an old idea in a new way. And I want you to be willing to try something different. That is my highest hope for our time together. It's a big, bold goal, I know. So let's get started. I believe this to be true, that significant learning happens within a significant relationship. So how are we going to do that? Today, because we are looking through the screen at each other, I am going to do a couple things. I'm going to ask you questions that I hope that you take seriously, and I want you to really ponder how you might respond if we were sitting together over a pint or a cup of coffee. I am going to share things that are maybe a little deeper, kind of like drop down a gear than what you're probably used to in these kinds of professional training experiences. Namely because I think you can handle it, and I think it's appropriate, and I think that it is necessary. So that will be a little bit of a different flavor than what you're used to in these kinds of things, okay? So in 1973, a 15-year-old girl was standing next to her bed, packing her grungy things in a grungy bag and being sent home after her second tour through the foster care system. Now, this was saying something because it was 1973, and this was a professional family, white parents, and the system removed the kids from the house, 4 children from the house on more than one occasion, which is sort of an anomaly for 1973 in a small town. So this 15-year-old is returned home to discover her mother is gone, and there is a visibly pregnant 18, 19-year-old in the house with her father. And it turns out that this woman was pregnant with her father's child. She was a student. So this 15-year-old goes back to living her life and finds out within a few months that she herself is pregnant. Now, the father of this baby, his family was very pious, very powerful religious. And she shares the news, and this family begins to treat her pretty roughly. Like the father would follow her around in the small town and call her Jezebel and say terrible things to her. So she gathers these people together to have a meeting just as her biological father has a heart attack, and she decides, I am not bringing a child into this craziness. I am adopting this child away. And she gathers these folks together and tells them this is the decision that she's making, and tells them, you cannot go find this child. If this child ever wants to come find us, then that will be what happens. And she paused in her narrative and she looked up at me and said, and then you did. So this was a handful of years ago, and we've spent some time building our stories, how her life developed, how my life developed. That woman, my biological mother, is that young lady packing a pack of Cools in her hand. Now, what she also shared with me is that she delivered me on the same day of the Battle of the Sexes tennis match. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And it was this notorious, like, sexist, misogynist dude, and Billie Jean King beat him in, like, I think two sets. So I she shared that with me to say, I was, to cope with the emotionality of what was happening, I focused on that. I became kind of obsessed. So your final weeks that you were marinating in me, I was obsessed with this gender equity and social justice thing that was happening culturally. So maybe that is what sort of informs your worldview, which was a little data point I thought was interesting. So I share this with you because I am sort of cooked in living in psychological flexibility spaces, meaning I was adopted and felt chosen and loved, but I also did not belong or fit in. I understood the pain and the loss of a sacrifice or a choice that a person made, but also that it was an act of love. So I sort of come to this psychological flexibility thing, accepting that all kinds of things can be true all at once as a human and as a professional. So those things collide and leave me pretty committed to teaching this to folks because I understand what it can lead to in terms of resiliency, thriving after trauma or loss, and building businesses, companies, leading teams. The same skills that help folks come back from the brink are the same skills people use to build entities, families, and businesses that thrive. So I'm going to start with a couple of ground zero things that inform what I'm going to be teaching today. I'm going to share something I loathe, and I'm going to share something I love. So one of the things I loathe is toxic positivity. It is underneath, it's sort of like an insidious fuel underneath a lot of stuff that isn't great in corporate cultures and in families. It fuels denial and avoidance. It sort of kind of glosses over things that are tough, but true and necessary. So you will not hear anything that has toxic positivity underneath it from me. That being said, I do describe myself as a ruthless optimist, which is a thinking thing we'll get to in a second. So one of the reasons that toxic positivity is such a thing for a therapist is that we are the places where people share their true stories. So these words are exact quotes from people who have sat in my office and shared with me what was really going on for them. Now, I don't know, we're not in a room together, so I can't see your faces, but I guarantee that you can relate to some piece of this. And if we did a show of hands or you put it in the comment section, I'm sure that we would all go, yeah, okay, I've been there. So this underlying sense of avoiding tough truths is something that a lot of folks like me have a stomach for. We don't like it. Okay, so something that I love. I love Venn diagrams. I love them. I love them so much that I have one tattooed on my wrist. The reason I love them is that they are a visual representation of psychological flexibility. It is a visual way of saying what else might be true, and teaching ourselves to go slow through the behave forward framework and asking that question can be transformative. I can't tell you how many leaders were on a train track somewhere, really truly attached to their version of a story, why an employee didn't want to be promoted or why somebody was behaving a certain way. But by asking, well, what else might be possible? They actually ended up solving the problem with fewer resource expenditures of time, money, and effort. Okay, so I read a lot of, and I definitely have a problem with collecting books. And I just moved. I moved my office and I moved my home in the last 90 days. So in the moving process, I dug up a bunch of boxes of books, and I was not a very efficient packer, I'll be honest, because I kept stopping and screenshotting these pictures of these books and then texting them to like my kids and my staff and my friends. Like, can you believe this was in a business book? This is crazy. Like, so for example, no mountains of ringlets on top of your head because that's unprofessional. Yikes. Isn't that crazy? That was from the mid 90s, and this was in a business book. So I share, oh, and one of my favorites, that visual down there of people touching each other at work, the stress relief games. Can you imagine that happening now, where you have people get up and touch each other? And it's like even better that there's a woman and a man and a woman on the cover of that book. It's delightful. So I share that to point out to you that we do change. We have evolving thought about what leadership looks like, how to run a team, and I try to keep up on it. I really do. Now, this was not staged. If you look at that stack of books, that is real. That was the pile that next to my bed, or next to the couch downstairs, actually, before we packed it up and moved it to our new house. So I am always trying to stay up on what smart people are thinking. And shout out to HR Like a Boss on my pile there. So at this point in time, I've given probably tens of thousands of hours of seminars, keynotes, workshops, and as an adjunct professor, have taught for hours. And I can tell you, I'm always looking for the gem statement. What is the thing underneath it? What's the understory? I stumbled on this article in 2022 that was a meta-analysis. I don't know if you know what that is, like a literature review meta-analysis of like 55,000 studies. And they were trying to get to what leads to good outcomes in therapy. And can we distill this to something like one or two constructs? And what they discovered was psychological flexibility is the thing that is the outcome in an effective therapeutic engagement. And it was sort of like this, okay, so I read this article, I drew that little grid for my client, and I thought, okay, this is it. This is a framework that gives people the tools to actually execute on some of these ideas, which are literally transformative for folks. So I want to ask you, before we get into the quadrants, how self-aware are you? So give yourself a number, 1 to 10. Okay. Do you have your number? So if you, and I guarantee at least one person was having this thought, if you are thinking about who you know who is not self-aware, you're in good company. A lot of people do this. But if you are like, I am a 10, I am a total 10, then I have a book I want you to check out. I'm just teasing. The idea that we are walking around totally self-aware is, it's sort of been culturally co-opted, because what most people say when I say, well, how self-aware are you? The people that give themselves 10s frequently, and I would say significant majority of the time, what they're actually saying is, I am very in touch with my emotions, which is 25% of the formula of self-awareness, which is an F. So we're going to pull at this a little bit. Okay. What does it actually mean to be self-aware? About 15% of people, and this is pretty consistent in the literature, especially in the business literature, actually are self-aware. So I don't want you to think about self-awareness as an end game, but rather a set of practices. So I want you to be thinking, okay, what are my self-awareness practices? What are the things I'm consistently doing and integrating into my day? Now, what is true is that feedback from others is one of the ways that we cultivate a self-awareness practice, right? So we're thinking about who in your life tells you the truth. Now, I know for me, my teenagers, as they matriculated through the house, I could always count on them to tell me what their truth was anyway about something I was doing. And I think I learned a couple of important things about myself because of honest feedback. So, who are your reliable narrators? Who are your loving critics? Do you have 2 or 3 people that you would consider your loving critics? Now, the barriers to this are real. So, power, the more power you have in a structure, the less likely people are to be honest with you. So, this is usually at work, right? Also at home. This is why the teenager thing, because they don't care. And so power is a barrier, and experience, because the more experience we have, the more attached we get to our own sense of expertise. And we can become kind of rigid and less open to changing our mind, which is also what we're going to talk about today. The number 3 barrier to self-awareness is people who are highly introspective, because they are in their own cognitive hamster wheel up here, and it is less likely for them to have external feedback that will index for them. And we can explore that. That's always something that people are curious about, because highly introspective people tend to think of themselves as very self-aware. So it's an interesting paradox that can happen. So the truth is the most powerful thing on the planet that exists. So in my line of work, sometimes the truth can be devastating. Just, it can be an implosion. It can be betrayal at work, at home. Sometimes truth can be quiet and a sort of gentle process where I kind of watch it happen, where someone lands on something, a new truth for them, and it's like they're free. It's quite sacred to me to be in space with someone and watch that unfold. So we can't necessarily do that interactively here, but it is ultimately the goal. So here's a couple things you can take with you, okay? Self-awareness homework. Take these slides, workshop this for yourself. This is some stuff you can do on your own. And if you dig up anything that you want to interrogate with somebody, yes, people like me can be very, very helpful. And a couple of those names, those loving critics, maybe those folks could be good partners in exploring that. I decided to share this too. This is, I call this the 9. So when I do executive work, I have this rotating list of questions that, based on my phone consult, I will customize this for a client. And it is I call them it's like my ruthless self-inventory, where I'll pick 9 questions that I want somebody to begin to explore in their internal life. So I shared 9 of my favorites from my ruthless self-inquiry questionnaire. All right, so the toggles, okay? These squares, I want you to be thinking about them as a tile, okay? So you think stuff, you feel stuff, you have a container that you get to do a life in, that's your body, and behavior is how we interact and transact with others, and it is the most important quadrant up there. And how we move around those things, which tile is louder for you, is as unique as humans. So let's start with thoughts. I don't know about you guys, but I have had experiences where I make a movie in my head about some sort of apocalyptic thing and then have a real physical experience in my body because I'm having feelings about it. And it's real, but it's based on fiction. Meaning, okay, so have you ever been waiting for somebody, like a kid, spouse, or partner, and they're late? And in that 15 minutes, you have them like in a car wreck on the side of the highway. And you call them, and then you start compulsively calling them. And then they walk in the door with like a gallon of milk. And they're like, what? They walk in, and you're just so escalated by the time they walk in. that your body, that's real, but it's based on a fiction that you've created in your head. So we walk around pretty attached to the stuff we think, but there are all kinds of distorted ways that we perceive our reality. So there are 90 billion neurons up here floating around in the dark, and hundreds of trillions of connective paths are made every day. And so this machine up here, this perceiving machine, is highly inefficient. Like, think first generation Hummer, okay? 4 miles a gallon, 3 miles a gallon. So in order to maximize the glucose burn, there's like these paths that we develop. And so we get pretty attached to the things we think because we've thought them a lot, but that doesn't mean that they're accurate. So a lot of what therapists do, what psychologists do, is help people interrogate some of the things people believe about themselves or the world or their place within it. And there are various ways of tackling those things. Let me give you an example. What do you think about your work? Scale 1 to 10. Put a number in your head. Get your number? Okay. Now, I want you to rate these things. So, are the numbers different? Is there a range? Now, most of the time, the answer is yes. So what we tend to do is anchor our experience to the lowest number and begin to see everything through that rating, when in fact, what is going on is layered and complicated. So for example, when I do this with folks, maybe there are 3 things on that list that are a 2, but there are other things that are 7, 8, or 9. And maybe we then place that in the life context where, okay, I have young kids and childcare and commute and salary or leveraging this role for later. All of those contextual things also matter instead of just, I hate my job, right? Which is this, okay? A cognitive distortion can be your world gets really small, but a cognitive distancing strategy, which is what we just did, helps you just put a little breath in there, just a little space in there so that you could examine it from a more granular perspective. So learning how to do this is in that thinking quadrant where people like me can be handy, faith leaders can be handy, in your community. Being with folks helps you realize when maybe you're attached to something that you're thinking about someone else. That's why it's good for us to be around people who think differently, which is also happening less and less, which is kind of a cultural thing happening right now. So all of these things here are cognitive distancing strategies so that you can use in the thinking quadrant of the Behave Forward framework. Okay. All right. Let's bump over to feelings. This is my handy dandy fave tool to use with people. I think pretty much everybody that has ever sat in my office, we use this at some point. And it's delightful to me because the interaction that people have with this wheel is so wide ranging. Let me give you an example. So if I ask somebody, let's say over 50, to tell me something that they feel, about 90% of the time, they tell me things they think. Okay. If I ask somebody under the age of 25 to tell me things that they think about something, they frequently tell me things they feel. These people are all working with you, for you, and it is, I believe, one of the most important pieces of today's workforce that we aren't doing a very good job talking about or dealing with. It's this communicating around thinking and feeling, which are 2 different things. And so we really mess this up if we aren't dealing with the fact that we have affect. So I'm going to tell you some things about feelings that are scientific and factual. So they're thinking things about feelings. Okay. So our emotions are neural alarms. I mean, they are embedded in our brain. And some of our first emotions were warning. They're like neural alarms that are instant plans for life events. Okay. And we kind of come into the world with some basic affect, and they are survival mechanisms. And then as we evolve, we develop much more nuance and granularity to our affective life. But emotions are key. They're like kind of how we survive. And I was reading The Covenant of Water. I don't know if anyone read that book. And as they talked about leprosy colonies and sort of the where the novel was set and whatnot, that with leprosy, why people ended up being severely harmed is that they couldn't feel things. So they burn themselves, they hurt themselves, they don't know when there's an infection. Like feeling physical pain is essential for staying alive. Feeling emotional pain is also essential for staying alive. It's just supposed to be short and swift. Okay. And we can kind of pull at that thread as much as you want to when we have time at the end. But here's the thing. Okay. High emotionality kills empathy. So this is something we're getting wrong culturally too. Okay. Empathy is a thinking thing, not a feeling thing. And I could spend an hour just talking about this wheel, but I just, want you to take this nugget with you. Okay. Somebody that says, well, I'm highly self-aware, because I'm an empath, that the stats are not in their favor, that's actually what's happening. They're in touch with their own affective life and their own feelings, but that is not empathy. Empathy is a decision that we make that somebody else's experience has merit, weight, and value and matters. And it is a kind of cultural catastrophe that we aren't talking about this in the right way. Empathy is a decision. Now, is it based on affect? Of course, it's in the cocktail, but it isn't the thing, because being really in touch with your own emotions is basically a 2.5-year-old. I don't know if you've ever been around a 2.5-year-old, but they're little narcissists. They are not empathic. They are into what they are feeling in that moment. And I carried both my kids out of Target, I don't even know how many times, because they wanted the thing. And I said, no, like, I think anyone who's ever parented has been there. So again, this is one of those constructs that we can come back to if you're interested or curious to know more. Now, I could also spend 3 hours just talking about this beautiful wheel. Use this wheel if you have never seen it before, and 5 times a day, 5 to 7 days in a row, check in on yourself and go, what am I experiencing right now? Because whether you know it or not, this stuff is fueling your thinking stuff. It is connected to how you experience things in your body, and it drives behavior. So if you aren't paying attention to it, it's driving stuff. Other things about this wheel. Who gets to show emotions in your house, in your family, in your business? There's this term called emotional display rules. Like, who gets to show feelings and who doesn't? What feelings are you rewarded for showing, meaning display, and what are you punished for? And it's a story that I've told before. So some folks here might have heard me tell this before. I've had a circuitous career path, and one of my journeys in my professional life, I've had a heavy ops career as well as being an adjunct and a trauma therapist. I spent time in a construction trailer and I was the only woman, it was all men. And I kind of functioned as the owner's rep, and I was the administrative oversight. Who was going to go where? This was a lot of emotions around this decision, this new research building. Is a $140 million research building on Ohio State's campus. And after a few months of being in a trailer with the fellas, I was like, holy cow, these guys are the most emotional people I have ever worked with. And so I showed up one day and behaved in an emotional way. I stomped in and I threw my files down and I kicked the filing cabinet and I sighed loudly and I cussed a lot. And they were like, what is going on with you? And I said, good Lord, if I behaved the way you guys behave, you would think I was crazy and you would not believe anything I say. I work really hard to display behavior that is appropriate for this context, and rather than just display anger, because anger is a feeling, guys. You're so emotional. Now, I had a significant relationship with these guys, and so they heard me and they worked on it. They worked on it, and they're actually sitting right here. So I'm going to show you. At the end of the project, I didn't do this on purpose. I am still getting settled in. They gave me these, which are two giant nuts, and said for the woman or for the person in the trailer with the largest pair, so Willery, you're gonna be mad at me for being inappropriate, but it's factually accurate. That is a true story. So this idea that who gets to display feelings and who doesn't is huge. It's still a big issue in corporate context. I think I talk about this at least once a week, especially with women who are in the C-suite or are serving on corporate boards and kind of in that, 5 to 10% leadership roles within companies. It's still a thing. So changing your mind is a journey, right? So this little slide here shows you that kind of the phases of change that we go through when it comes to thinking about our feelings. So you can be going along in life and then whoop, there it is, life disrupted. I think every single person on the other side of this little glass hole could tell me a story about, well, I thought we were headed in this direction and then boop, here we go. Change is this transition from what was to what will be. And our resistance to it is all of the affect that's on the left side of that wheel. What's unknown, undefined, unproven, scary, feels a certain way. It's uncomfortable. And so learning how to tolerate uncomfortableness is a big part of accepting psychological flexibility, that it is a temporary state, not a trait. So here are some things I want you to change your mind about. And this is a loaded slide. There's a lot here. These are things we kind of get into, but are actually not accurate. So when managers and folks who aren't trained try to act like therapists, employees' mental health is worse. The data is clear. When response teams come in after a crisis and make people focus on their sad, scary feelings, the mental health outcome is worse. When people are asked to use I statements, remember that was kind of the thing in the 80s and the 90s. When you're talking about negative experiences, if you're making repetitive I statements, mental health outcomes are worse. When children are told they are amazing and wonderful, which are identity statements, not ability statements, their mental health is worse. Where they get really, really attached to their idea, well, I am this way. So it makes them resist taking risks or being uncomfortable. We could probably talk about that for an hour. We all know scrolling through a social media feed makes your mental health worse. And when it comes to changing hearts and minds, when you mechanize shame, people don't change their mind, because when people feel shame, they freeze. They get into a functional freeze. And so when you're in a work context and you're changing hearts and minds about really, really important stuff, there is a nuance and a sophistication to doing that that doesn't mechanize shame. So here, all of these things are attached to affect underneath them. All right, so thoughts, feelings, body, behavior. So let's talk a little bit about body. Okay, we'll get there because I want to get to the behavior part, which is the most important part of our behavior forward framework. So you get one container to do a life in. You're in it. We get one container, and taking care of it can have a profound impact on things you feel and your thinking. This is functionally true, but your body also teaches you stuff. Like, I don't know if you've ever been in an experience where like you feel it in your body first and you know something's off, right? Now, I could ask people who grew up in abusive households, how they would sense what was going on. And people that grew up with chaos or abuse, they'll tell you stories. Like, I could walk in the house and listen for how the cabinet doors in the kitchen were being shut, and I could then tell you what kind of evening we were going to have. And they would feel it. They'd index on it in their body. So your body is a really powerful tool in this framework and beyond the scope of what we could get into today, but it's up there because it's critical. So this is tongue in cheek. This is a facetious slide. But it's also true. I never fired anybody over the course of my professional life because of what they felt or how I felt. It was behavior. I've never seen a marriage implode because of feelings or thoughts. It was behavior. So how we behave with each other is relational currency. It is the way that we transact. When these things get conflated, thoughts, feelings, body, behavior, it becomes very difficult to execute. And so I want you to put that in your head as okay, I am allowed to think anything I want to. I'm going to feel stuff. Can't help that. What matters is the volume, which the Behave Forward framework helps you to kind of toggle around. But what's most important is the behavior you choose to deploy. It's the most important piece up there. And it doesn't mean that those other things aren't real or aren't happening for you or what make you precious and human. All those things can be true at the same time, and choosing the behavior you're going to use is critical. So I will share one body thing for you as an example of how powerful it is. So if I'm working with a couple, for example, I will do the 3 hand gestures thing. So if the thing you are about to say matches with this particular hand gesture, and you know the one I'm going to do, I'm going to hide it. Okay. If the thing you're about to say matches that hand gesture, don't say it. Okay. And it's a way of sort of tracking too, like, oh, okay, I'm about to just like kind of be angry and vent and just kind of do a thing at a person. Don't do it. If it goes with this hand gesture, right? That's life lessoning and telling people about themselves and helping, which is the sunny side of control. Don't do it. So if the words go with first hand gesture or this hand gesture, don't say it. Try to make your words match with this hand gesture where you put them in your lap, palms up, and you go, okay, I am experiencing. I want to share. It just sort of, your body sort of forces you when you're escalated, if you kind of match the thing. And if you sit there and you put your hands, okay, I have to match the words to what I'm doing with my body. It's a little dicey, I know that, but it can help shake it a bit so that you land on something that is ultimately going to be more hearable by the other party. So here are the Behave Forward essential questions. Okay. These are the ones that I want you to keep with you, and they are a piece of the framework because each one of these involves all 4 quadrants, and your answers are going to be as unique to you. Some of my favorites, I love number 1. Do you want to be right or do you want to win? Okay. Most people are seduced by the idea of being right. And it is not always what is strategic for a relationship or a team or a business. How do you get to the win? What does the win look like? And it's a freeing question. Do you want to be right or do you want to win? It's one of my favorites up there. And is the thing I'm about to say illuminating or diminishing? That is a powerful thing to ask yourself when you are going into more contentious situations, because sometimes it feels really good to make somebody feel small. And I've seen that do more damage to company cultures than maybe anything else. And is this thing I'm about to do contributing or performative? So I love this when I go to conferences. I'm sure you guys can relate to this. And the person gets up to the microphone to like ask a question and they just talk for 10 minutes. That it is a thing to ask yourself, all right, is this am I performing something here, or am I trying to contribute in meetings, at conferences? Now, every now and then, so let's bump down to number 9. Is this thing I'm about to do showy, sloppy, or strategic? That might be my favorite one now that I'm looking at it. So the showy thing, am I trying to perform my intellectual superiority? Am I trying to like just take up some oxygen here in this meeting? Okay. Usually that person doesn't know that's them. Sloppy. Is it, when it's that, it's emotional, right? Is it just sort of this like, verbal emotional vomit in the meeting or the conference? Or is it strategic? Because sometimes asking a question in a public context that shows insight or whatnot is a little strategic. You're not being showy, but there's also an ulterior motive. I don't hate that. But whatever you do, do on purpose and know that's what's happening. So mess around with these behave forward essential questions. And in closing, another one of my favorite Venn diagrams. This one really tickles me. So as a reminder, what else might be possible? Asking yourself, is this a thinking thing or a feeling thing? They are not the same. Split them apart, and it can help you not feel paralyzed or in a functional freeze when you need to make a tough decision. What does it look like to behave forward? Are you appropriately resourced so that you can do that? And go enjoy these Venn diagrams. I hope you like them as much as I do. I like questions. If we have questions, we have some more time, and I hope you left with a little nugget to deploy in your personal and professional life. And thank you for your time.